Let's quickly look at one example. This one here, top right, that hearing tests are for all who value their hearing. The simplest way we can do this is to piggyback on the already accepted idea that people get their eyes and teeth checked regularly in order to prevent problems. So, eyes checked, teeth checked, hearing checked. Easy to remember and easy to apply. Remember, people don't go to the dentist for a filling. They go to get the best out of their teeth throughout life. And that's how we need people to see the hearing test. It's a way to get the best out of their hearing throughout life. So how do we go about crafting our messages to ensure that we're triggering the correct thought processes? Well, essentially, it's just like fishing. If you use the right word, it's like using the right bait to catch a specific fish. Some thoughts are more likely to bite, whilst others will totally ignore our bait. And if you remember from earlier on in the presentation, it's all about which thoughts our audience finds easiest to pull up at the time. So it helps us to understand that our brains are wired to follow specific rules when it comes to thought processes. And that's going to help us here. Let's take a look at some of those rules. We've already looked at the first one, sticky messages. Secondly, repeated associations. Things that through repeatedly occurring with one another become automatically linked in people's minds. The third one is what our audience was already thinking. Fourthly, labels and stereotypes. And finally, the way we frame something. So let's briefly take a look at how each of these work. Take a look at this image. What word springs to mind? If you thought Marlboro, that was no accident. Your thought process there was due to years of repeated associations by the cigarette manufacturer. The colours they use, the shape of the triangle at the top there, the rugged cowboy imagery all recall Marlboro. As advertising rules have become tighter for cigarette manufacturers, it's become more important to them that they trigger thoughts and feelings of their products without even having to mention their name. So effective is their marketing through repeated associations that they can sponsor bars in America so that just the colour and shape of the furniture, and even what's playing on the bar's TV, such as a cowboy movie or Formula One, will trigger a desire in smokers to light up. So if repeated associations are effective for something like cigarettes, think of how we should be using it to change attitudes towards hearing care. What do we want people to associate with having their hearing tested and using hearing aids? This image shows someone going back to check that their door is locked. Are they taking a sensible precaution, or are they neurotic? We don't know, because we don't have enough information. But our interpretation may depend on whether we've encountered a story about an increase in burglaries or a story about someone struggling with obsessive-compulsive disorder. Our audience's prior thoughts help to interpret our own words and messages. This applies to attitude formation too. If someone goes for a hearing test because they're thinking eyes checked, teeth checked, hearing checked, they'll have a different attitude towards the hearing test and even their own hearing than if they thought, well, only deaf people have hearing tests. So let's think about what prior thoughts we need our audience to have in order to correctly approach hearing care. Now this is an absolutely fascinating bit of research. A group of participants were asked to do a scrambled sentence test. The test was apparently about their proficiency with language, but actually there was a hidden purpose. Now a scrambled sentence test works a bit like this. You have a group of words that you have to unscramble into a meaningful sentence as quickly as you can. For example, the grey cat sat on the mat. Now one group of participants worked on sentences that had neutral words in it. But for the other group, each sentence contained one word that could often be associated with a stereotype for the elderly. For example, the grey cat sat on the mat. My dog's name is Bingo. He ironed the wrinkles out of the shirt. So the sentences themselves had nothing to do with being elderly, and the target words weren't obviously to do with the elderly when taken out of context. But here's the weird thing. As the participants left the laboratory, they were secretly timed as they walked up the corridor. Those who had worked on the elderly stereotype sentences walked significantly more slowly than the neutral group. Somehow, by subconsciously triggering the stereotype for the elderly, it had affected their behaviour. Now, this isn't just a fluke or a one-off result. This principle has been repeated in lots of other research using all sorts of attitudes and stereotypes. Words have a lot of power that we don't fully understand, especially when it comes to stereotypes, such as the elderly. So we have to be careful which stereotypes we're causing people to bring up with our own words and messages, because this has an impact on our audience's subsequent behaviour. Do we make people act old or disabled with our messages? Or do we make people feel empowered or more themselves? Now, a stereotype is a form of label, and we use labels all the time. They help us to separate out our thoughts and recall lots of information that's related together very quickly. They're essentially a mental shortcut. Labels can be specifically created and then stuck onto a specific chain of thought. A good example might be the label climate change. Those words have been deliberately stuck onto carbon emissions, being green, rising sea levels, global warming, the need to recycle. So using that single label, climate change, is going to trigger all those associations very quickly. Take a look at these two cans here. How do we know what's in them? Well, we could open them both up and take a look inside, but that's long-winded and rather wasteful. It'd be much easier if the cans were labelled in the first place. So now, which one would you have for your tea? The can on the left or the can on the right? You see, not only do labels help us to separate two things from another, they also help us to decide whether to avoid or approach something. It brings us right back to attitudes. So we can use this principle of labelling to help people approach the correct attitude and avoid unhelpful ones. For example, we should never use the label stigma. Instead, we should label it old-fashioned attitudes. You see, the problem with the label stigma is that if we encounter someone who knows nothing about hearing aids or hearing care, and we use the word stigma, our audience begins thinking, well, why would there be a stigma anyway? And so they start to answer that question themselves by creating their own reasons for there being a stigma. And so we end up inadvertently perpetuating the stigma. But if we say old-fashioned attitudes, then people think to themselves, well, I don't want to be seen as being behind the times. And so those people are more inclined to listen to new messages about hearing care. Another example of how labelling works against us. If we tell someone they need a hearing aid, what's the thought process here that we need to be aware of? Well, firstly, if you tell someone they need something, they think, there's something wrong with me, or I'm different. All thoughts that people automatically try to avoid. The words hearing aid is a label, and so it's a shortcut for all sorts of other associations that people have made during the course of their lives. So we need to be aware of how we label things, and if the labels we are using are unhelpful, we may need to develop new ones or somehow change the associations they have for someone.